November 8th, 1942, 4:30 a.m. The El Alamein line, Western Desert, Egypt. A German signals officer sits in a sandbagged post 12 miles behind the front lines, listening to a silent field telephone. For the past 6 hours, it rang constantly. Units reported breaches, commanders demanded orders, artillery officers begged for fire missions that could not be delivered because the very guns they were directing had already been overrun. Now the line is quiet, and this officer understands, with the brutal clarity of a man facing defeat, that the silence is far worse than the noise. He has been here since June. He watched Rommel capture Tobruk in a single day. He watched the Afrika Korps push the British Eighth Army back 500 miles across the sand in what the Germans called the Great Retreat. Now, in reverse, during the Great Advance, he watched this line go up, the strongest defensive position in North Africa, anchored on the impassable Qattara Depression to the south and the Mediterranean to the north. 40 miles of minefields, wire, and trenches Rommel called his Devil's Garden. The British had been throwing themselves at it for weeks, dying in the wire. Yet the signals officer remained unworried. He is Deutsches Afrika Korps. He has never lost a defensive line he was ordered to hold. But in the next 4 hours, an event in the desert outside will leave the German High Command and the Italian Comando Supremo completely stunned, and Erwin Rommel himself will spend the rest of the war struggling to adequately explain. The line built to be the ultimate barrier between the Axis and the Nile will cease to exist, and the men who broke it were not Americans with their massive industrial weight, nor the French with their fury, nor the Australians who had already bled both sides white at Tel Elisa. They were British, ordinary British infantry from the counties, mill towns, and fishing villages of a nation at war for 3 years, running on something that looks from this distance less like military strategy and more like pure defiance. What those soldiers faced, and what the German army later admitted, stands as one of the most stunning and complete confessions of the entire North African campaign. If this history hits you the way it hit me when I first uncovered these after-action records, a quick like takes just 2 seconds, and it shares this historic story with the next person who deserves to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. More history is on the way. To understand the weight of what the Germans confessed after El Alamein, we must understand what they believed about that line before the British even touched it. The Panzer Army Africa had been building the El Alamein position since July of 1942, not as a temporary stop, but as a massive fortress. Organization taught and combat engineers worked the ground in shifts. And what they built across those 40 miles was a defensive system incorporating every lesson the Wehrmacht had learned in 3 years of war. Imagine the approach from the east as we walk it through the eyes of a British infantryman. Perhaps a Lancashire Fusilier or Highland Light Infantry, recruited from Glasgow tenements and Lanarkshire coal towns. These men had been in the desert so long they had stopped thinking about England. They thought of water, shade, and the ground immediately in front of their boots. Yet what lay ahead, hidden from view, was a massive minefield belt 1/2 mile deep, containing roughly 500,000 mines in total, the densest minefield concentration in the history of warfare to that point. The Germans called it the Teufelsgarten, the Devil's Garden, laid not in simple lines, but in interlocking patterns designed to channel attacking infantry into pre-registered killing zones. Behind the mines lay a continuous belt of wire, threaded with deadly anti-personnel devices. Behind the wire lay strong points held by mixed German and Italian garrisons. Each was positioned to provide flanking fire on the approaches to the next. And behind it all, the 88mm guns. Remember that number. 88. The German 88mm flak gun, repurposed for anti-tank duty, was the single most feared weapon of the Desert War. At 2,000 yards, it could punch straight through any Allied tank in service. The Afrika Korps had 86 of them deployed along the El Alamein line, dug in and hull down, perfectly camouflaged, with pre-registered fields of fire covering every approach. Behind those stood the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, Rommel's armored fist, ready to crush whatever managed to survive the wire, mines, and 88s. Rommel himself wrote to his wife in late October that this position was impregnable if held with determination. He specifically chose that word impregnable. Remember that word? The commander tasked with proving him wrong was General Bernard Montgomery, and his instrument of choice was the Eighth Army, a force that had been retreating and reorganizing for the better part of 2 years. Montgomery gave these men something they had sorely lacked: a clear, understandable plan. This was artillery on a scale the Desert War had never seen, backed by a blunt promise: no more retreating. The Eighth Army would stand and fight right there, or they would not fight at all. To spearhead the northern assault, Montgomery chose 4 elite infantry divisions, starting with the 9th Australian Division on the coastal road. The 51st Highland Division took the center. These were men from Inverness, Aberdeen, and the Western Isles, fighting under the same divisional flash their fathers wore at the Somme, with the 2nd New Zealand and 1st South African Divisions completing the line. Every division was paired with brave engineer units, tasked with clearing lanes through the minefields under heavy fire. Behind them stood over 900 guns. Let's let that massive number sink in for a moment. 922 guns were precisely coordinated for the opening barrage of Operation Lightfoot. When they opened fire at 21:40 hours on October 23, 1942, the roar reached Cairo. The brave infantry stepped forward behind the barrage, marching straight into the deadly Devil's Garden. The events of the next 12 days created 2 parallel stories, and understanding their connection reveals why the Germans ultimately conceded defeat. Along the northern axis, the 51st Highland Division charged through the German minefields across a 3-mile front. Their objectives were low-lying ridges with names that meant absolutely nothing back in Scotland, but everything in this dry desert. Places like Kidney Ridge, Materia Ridge, and a barren hilltop the Highlanders simply called Point 29. The brutal combat over those 12 days was unlike anything the division had experienced since Dunkirk. The Axis defensive grid worked exactly as designed, heavily shelling mine-clearing teams in the pitch dark before they could even finish carving out safe paths. Soldiers advancing through these unfinished gaps got trapped in barbed wire, cut to pieces by flanking machine guns. German 88mm guns targeted the tanks as they crawled through, littering the desert with burning wrecks of Shermans, Grants, and Valentines. Yet, the Highlanders secured their objectives, lost them to fierce counterattacks, then reclaimed them at bayonet point, and they defended them against heavy Panzer attacks using only 6-pounder guns and a sheer stubbornness that German reports later described with utter bewilderment as completely unaccountable. Now, here is that crucial number we held earlier: 86 88mm guns. By November 4th, 67 had been destroyed or captured, not just suppressed and not neutralized. They were utterly obliterated by artillery, overrun by infantry, or abandoned by crews who had run completely out of ammunition. The very weapons meant to keep the El Alamein line unbreakable were systematically destroyed, gun by men advancing on foot. Along the southern front, the battle unfolded very differently. The 7th Armored Division and the Free French Brigade advanced slowly, successfully baiting German armored reserves south, away from the main breakthrough point. This was no accident. It was the second blade of Montgomery's tactical scissors, and it was cutting deep. The turning point arrived on November 2nd. Montgomery unleashed Operation Supercharge, massing all available tanks, and 2 fresh brigades for one massive strike across a 4,000-yard front. The 9th Armored Brigade spearheaded. Their commander was Brigadier John Curry, a seasoned cavalry officer from Lincolnshire, whose family had farmed the same soil since the 18th century. Superiors quietly informed him that 50% casualties would be acceptable. He was being ordered to sacrifice his brigade to punch a hole. Curry reviewed the plans and simply replied that it would work. He was entirely correct, especially about the terrible price. The 9th Armored Brigade lost 75 of their 94 tanks in the first hours of Supercharge, but they broke the final German anti-tank screen. As the 1st Armored Division flooded through the newly made gap, the defense line Rommel once deemed impregnable stood completely open. Now, let's look at what was happening on the German side, inside Panzer Army Africa headquarters. Inbound dispatches throughout the night of November 3rd and 4th described something far worse than a local retreat: a total systemic collapse. Frontline units that had been holding their ground went completely silent on their radios. Artillery batteries reported ammunition consumption at rates that made continued firing impossible, while the 15th Panzer Division, Rommel's armored reserve, tasked with sealing any breakthrough, reported that it had fewer than 30 operational tanks left. facing a British armored force still numbering in the hundreds. Rommel sent a direct signal to Hitler, requesting permission to withdraw. Hitler's reply was his infamous Sieg oder Tod order, victory or death. Hold the El Alamein line to the last man. Rommel read the command at his headquarters and then did something that reveals everything about the true state of the German position. He simply waited. He delayed compliance for nearly 24 hours, not out of defiance toward the Fuhrer, but because his defensive line had vanished. There was simply nothing left to defend. An after-action report written by German staff officers after El Alamein featured a phrase never before seen in any document from the Afrika Korps. It described how the British infantry fought through the minefields. The report admitted that the sheer persistence of their assault exceeded all prior experience with British offensives in North Africa. It surpassed all prior experience. These were elite German staff officers writing about ordinary men from Glasgow, Aberdeen, and the mill towns of Lancashire. They acknowledged, in dry bureaucratic language, that these soldiers had accomplished something completely outside their existing model of how the British fought. That admission sits right alongside a second document that is, in its own way, even more damning. The War Diary of the German 164th Light Division. Positioned in the central sector, they recorded on the night of November 4th that all contact with neighboring units was lost, and their artillery had run completely out of ammunition. The diarist recorded that the division was, in his own precise words, no longer capable of organized resistance. Not retreating, not withdrawing to prepared defenses, just no longer capable of organized resistance. The division that had held its ground against every assault for 12 days was now writing its own epitaph. Meanwhile, Rommel, the very commander who had written to his wife claiming this line was impregnable, fled El Alamein in a staff car. Driving west, he watched the broken survivors of his army retreat in the opposite direction. He later wrote that he had witnessed the complete destruction of his own army. Those were his words, not a British assessment or a post-war judgment by Allied historians. The commander of the Afrika Korps wrote that the 8th Army did not just push him back, they destroyed him. If you enjoy this history, please like and subscribe. This is the central admission of our story. Not a dramatic surrender speech, but a paper trail of quiet documents, and a legendary general fleeing the position he had once called impregnable, watching it fade in his mirror. Consider what we know. The Teufelsgarten, 500,000 mines and 86 88mm guns. It was backed by Rommel's personal confidence and 3 years of Wehrmacht experience, designed to make any breakthrough completely impossible. Yet the 51st Highlanders broke through. The Lancashire Fusiliers broke through as well. The 9th Armoured Brigade rode in, knowing the exact mathematical cost, and they went through anyway. The German signals officer, sitting in a silent, sandbagged bunker, stared at a telephone that had stopped ringing, hearing the sound of an era ending. Not just a defensive line, but a belief. The belief that the desert could be held, that the Nile was within grasp, and that the Afrika Korps was invincible in its prepared positions. The British infantrymen from the rural counties and industrial mill towns didn't shatter that illusion because they were invincible. Their memoirs state clearly that they were terrified, exhausted, and, in most cases, they kept advancing simply because the men right beside them were still moving. They marched into the Devil's Garden because there was a brother on their left and another on their right, and stopping was simply not an option in their presence. That human element was something the German reports could never calculate. It wasn't about equipment, numbers, or tactics. The massive gap between what those men should have done, statistically and rationally, considering the sheer horror buried in the sand ahead of them, versus what they achieved. Rommel called the line impregnable. The Highlanders called it